Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Conversations with GOG. Tonight, I am thrilled to be speaking with authors Maureen, Mahon, and Clover Hope about their latest books on Black women in rock and roll and hip hop, respectively. Before we begin, I encourage you to check the chat for links to Go On Girl Book Club, links to our authors' websites, and links for purchasing their books, as well as a playlist for each book. And feel free to post questions in the chat. I'll get to as many of them as time allows. And now on to our authors. Maureen Mahon is the author of Black Diamond Queens, African-American Women and Rock and Roll, an exploration of the pivotal part African-American women have played in the development of rock and roll. Her first book, Right to Rock, The Black Rock Coalition and the Cultural Politics of Race, discusses the ways African-American rock musicians used music and activism to challenge the limitations placed on Black expressive culture and Black identity in the 1980s and 1990s. Mahon's articles on African-American music have appeared in academic journals and on websites of National Public Radio and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She was the chief academic advisor for Soundtrack of America, the 5-night concert series commissioned by filmmaker Steve McQueen that opened the inaugural season of The Shed in 2019. She teaches in the Department of Music at New York University. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you, Julia. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. Our next author is Clover Hope. She's a Brooklyn-based writer and editor. Over a 16-year career, she's written for a range of publications, including Vibe, Essence, XXL, Elle, Billboard, Wired, The New York Times, Vogue, W, ESPN The Magazine, GQ, Cosmopolitan, Nylon, and The Village Voice, among others. Hope has held staff and writing and editing positions at Billboard, XXL, Vibe, and Jezebel. She's currently a contributing editor at pitchfork.com and an adjunct professor at New York University. Hope's first book, The Motherlode, 100 Plus Women Who Made Hip Hop, is a comprehensive illustrated book of women rappers. Welcome, Clover.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start by asking both of you for your respective genres, who is the first Black female artist that caught your ear, and what about them appealed to you? Maureen, we can start with you.
Okay, the first Black female artist who caught my ear was Nina Simone. And in terms of genre, Nina Simone always resisted being placed into a music genre category. She didn't like being called a jazz singer, which is usually where people placed her. But she was recently inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So now people in the world in that realm are claiming her. But from the time I was really little, it was Nina Simone, and it was a particular album, the Silk and Soul album, that really caught my ear, and I've been a fan ever since.
Okay, how about you, Clover?
There were others before, I kind of got into hip hop, Whitney Houston and the like, that I kind of like gravitated to through my father, who had all the vinyl records and things like that. But in the realm of hip hop, I would say Lil' Kim. I was around 13, 14 when she came out, and it was just kind of like this instant atom like explosion kind of when she came out in the 90s. And besides being a fan of hip hop, kind of like a budding fan of hip hop at that time, and just discovering, like my place and voice and women's place within the genre. She kind of, what appealed to me about her was what appealed to kind of everyone, was this intersection of like Black girls' identity and a Black girl's identity specifically within within rap. Her having to be like this kind of tiny voice within a crew, obviously being like this sexual, you know, her kind of like expressing her sexuality. I kind of saw in her just kind of like a nucleus, like her being kind of like a nucleus in a way of for women in hip hop. So she was big for me.
So, Maureen, I heard you in a conversation with music journalist Ann Powers, and you said you started working on your book before knowing how to write it. And I was thinking, certainly you could have taught a course on Black women and rock and roll, and maybe you do. And Clover, you could have written an article or a series of articles on women in rap. What made the both of you decide to put it in book form?
Should I start,
Sure,
Yeah.
Julia? Well, I really wanted to present the stories of these women in a way that would put them together to show that there's been a history of African American and women in rock and roll, which is something that I think is not an intuitive thought. The assumption about rock music is that it is music that is mostly by and for white people, although the music started in African American communities and it was labeled rhythm and blues, and all of the performers and the audiences were African American. But over the years, the music has been whitened. But there were always African American women who were participating. And so I wanted to trace that story and talk about, who was involved, what their involvement looked like, and what challenges they faced because of the way race worked in the music industry, and how they were able to circumvent some of those limitations. So it needed to be in a book. It needed to be more than a single article.
Right. And just same for me, like I wanted a visual documentation of like women's presence in hip hop, and to create a sort of new timeline that people maybe hadn't thought about when it comes to the narrative of hip hop and the culture. I think there is something that happens when it's not just an article, but like a series of like multiple accounts of something, and something that you can like flip through. And in my case, I have like illustrations of the women, and there's just kind of a sort of like double seeing that happens when you're reading about them and seeing them in some way. And so I wanted to have it like just the Motherlode itself, like the title is the point. Like here is like this kind of explosion of like gems of people who contributed so much to the culture that like half of them you may not even know about. And it's kind of this, it's, I think with the book, it turns it into not just like a timeline and history, but like an experience. And so, and also, like preserves not just their contributions, but their likenesses. So it was important for it to be like written. And I think we're both probably like print fans also, just like, holding something is still important, and having that preserved on paper is important, I think.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about the illustrations and all in your book a little later when I ask you specifically about your book. Now, you're both avid fans of the genres that you write about, but there's still a lot of research involved. Would you talk a bit about your research process and how long it took you to write your books? Clover, we'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, it was I guess, the kind of beginning answer is that it takes your whole life, because you have all these ideas in your head from when you start out as a fan of any music genre. But it was about maybe like 2.5 years of devoted research, where I was kind of like ordering old copies of The Source and Double XL on eBay. I had some buy magazines already, because a lot of the stories, I kind of started out doing interviews, and very quickly realized that a lot of these stories they're not Googleable. It's not something that you can kind of like search for, this female rapper who like released one song in 1997, and her story isn't necessarily documented somewhere that, frankly, young people can find. So I had to kind of like go through some old publications, Vibes, R&B Divas book was Hip Hop Divas book was huge in terms of research. And that was kind of a compilation of profiles that came out, I believe it was like the 2000s. So a lot of the research was firsthand accounts. I initially wasn't going to speak to so many women. And then the more I spoke to them, the more it unlocked, all these personal histories that contribute to this larger, like, collective history. And so for me, it was all about collecting personal histories and interviewing them and fitting them into the timeline, because their stories tell a bigger story. So, it was, a combination of just like, sifting and like searching for voices.
How about you, Maureen?
My process was sort of, I sort of stumbled into doing this because initially I was working with contemporary African-American women rock musicians, and I was planning to do really just interviews with them. But as we were talking, through the conversations kept coming back to this question of, well, who are the women before people like Tamar Kali, people like Martha Redbone, people like Toshi Regan, who were their foremothers? And so I started looking for information about them. And so it was actually a long process, because I was, constantly looking, trying to figure out who should I talk about, who should I focus on in the book, who had already been discussed a lot in the literature. And I was trying to talk about people who hadn't been so centralized in the discussions, but who were really important to the development and the formation of rock and roll. So I did, similar to what Clover described. It was a lot of archival work in magazines. I was looking at old issues of Rolling Stone, of Cream magazine, of the British music press was really great, because they really documented and covered African-American musicians in a way that the American music, the rock press wasn't doing. And so I really relied a lot on the British press as well. And then I did some interviews with the women who I write about. I spoke with Beverly Lee, who was one of the founding members of the Shirelles. I spoke with Gloria Jones, who was a background vocalist who worked with all kinds of rock musicians through the late 60s into the 70s. She was also a staff writer at Motown Records. And I talked with Sarah Dash, who was in LaBelle. So I did some interviews with women, but the primary focus was archival, magazines and newspapers, and then also listening to the music and looking at who they were working with and how they were connected.
Maureen, were some of the British publications, are they digitized? Were they easy to access?
No, no, which was great because I had an excuse to go to London. So I spent a really nice week in the British Library looking through this magazine called Sounds, which came out in the 1970s. And there was a lot of coverage of African-American women, especially women who had been background vocalists, which is one of the chapters in my book, because that was such an important sound in late 60s and early 70s rock. And I was able to listen to some of the music there. I was able to watch a televised performance that LaBelle did. They did a concert on BBC television in like 1975. I'd never seen a LaBelle concert before. So I was, deep in the weeds. I think now more stuff is digitized. I think Melody Maker and the New Musical Express you can get digitally now.
Okay. Now, Maureen, by highlighting Black women's contributions to rock and roll, you offer like the missing link to this music genre. Like if you thought you knew, you don't know until you read Black Diamond Queens. And, you dedicate a chapter to, different ones, Big Mama Thornton, Laverne Baker, the Shirelles, Betty Davis and Tina Turner. So it really helps to contextualize, by telling their story, really helps to contextualize the genre. How did you settle on that device to tell this story? And when I say the device, just, you know, talking, giving people stories to explain the bigger story.
Yeah, well, part of it was I like stories. I wish I had the brain that would allow me to write a novel, but I really don't. So, but I do love the stories of these women and how they just, all of these women were unusual. They were not typical. And that is something that really appeals to me about them. For them to go out on this path to be a performing artist and then to work in the genres that, you know, doing the stuff that they were doing at the time they were doing, they were kind of out there. So I like that about them. I wanted the chapters to be able to stand alone and make sense. And I did that because I'm my day job, my real job is I'm a professor. And so I was thinking about this as a book that people could assign to students. And I know that no one has time, I mean, people might not have time to read an entire book, but we could give students, you know, one chapter on one of these artists in a history of rock and roll class or in a women's music history class. And the story would make sense. So that's how I came up with that structure. So I wanted each chapter to stand alone, but then I also wanted to have a narrative thread of this, you know, the persistent presence of African-American women, the presence of their vocal sound, but this, what was very often a kind of erasure or, you know, a turning down of the volume on them and not accentuating their contribution, even as people were borrowing their sound, the way Elvis Presley borrowed from Big Mama Thornton, the way Janis Joplin borrowed from Big Mama Thornton. So they're, you know, they're making these really important contributions, but they weren't always getting acknowledged for them.
Now, Clover, when I first opened the Motherlode, I'm going to show it here because it's such a visual book. My first thought was Clover really tapped into her magazine sensibilities because not only did you provide an exhaustive listing of women MCs with informative articles about them, but you used listicles and infographics and even a pie chart along with the beautiful illustrations by Rachel Baker. Is that how you pronounce her name? Is it Rachel?
Rochelle, yeah. Rochelle.
Yeah. So I just want to show some of the pages. Like this is an infographic that appears in Clover's book, and this is women duo and groups. So along with giving each artist, I love this, a spread of.
Oh, great, yeah, she's amazing, yeah.
So and you when you give each artist, you know, it falls into these categories like never forget who she, never forget is something memorable about the artist, who she is, you explain it, and then listen would you include songs that are that artist's, like what they're known for, and then you go into, you know, the articles and give context. One thing that I found that made me laugh was you do a pie chart called Nicki Minaj Invented Color.
Yes.
So
yes.
How did you decide to present your book in this manner? And how did you come up with Nicki Minaj Invented Color? A color wheel.
I wanted it to be fun, number one. I did want to, you know, obviously tell these lost stories and unlock some of the histories that people did not know about or forgot, you know, the forgotten gems and people who maybe, you know, like you connected with in the 90s for a time, like a Soleil, you know, who, you know, I wanted to kind of jog people's memories. And yeah, my magazine background and just kind of being, I was obsessed with magazines growing up, from Vibe to like the teen mags, Essence, Jet, Ebony. Like I was just kind of like, you know, in addition to books and being like a library hog, like glossies and just this, I love the idea of just packaging stories and, you know, making it something where you could kind of like flip through it in a salon or something, or you kind of like, you know, in a moment's time, basically ingest all this history, like ingest like so much information in one sitting. I love, you know, just sounds basic, but I love learning. And so like, if you can just kind of flip through 3 pages on this book, and you get just hit with a lot of kind of you know, like overload of information. I feel like even like that kind of like triggers your brain, and you're like now imprinting these women in a different way in your brain. Like you're associating them with, you know, with their style, or like their you know, with Nikki, like her you're associating her with color and like with reinvention. And so, you know, I wanted to it was an intentional way to kind of make it not just like textbook, but also sort of coffee table book, and you know, appeal to a swath of um, fans, you know, the average fan who may not know, who may know kind of like the basics, the kind of like hip hop connoisseur who kind of knows a lot, but maybe has, you know, these gaps in knowledge, or someone who maybe doesn't know, you know, maybe knows like 3 artists like in the book. So, you know, I wanted to make it an experience, and each, you know, chart or list, you know, I kind of thought about it as like an extension of that artist, and, you know, um, what is kind of the main idea, or what is something, you know, interesting, or like a compelling nugget that I can like break out, basically. So for Nikki, it was, all right, we know her as someone who like killed the red carpet when she came out, and she was part of her, you know, rise was that she created this like persona and this like costuming. And so I wanted to draw attention to that. For example, with Cardi B, her sidebars, like some of the slogans that she's, you
Right.
know, like some of her quotables, basically. And that's what we know her for. Like, you know, just her kind of like shocking, like whatever one-liners and things like that. So yeah, I wanted to, you know, just kind of basically have extend their stories in a way that was just a little bit more visual. And it was yeah, I just love magazines, so it was a reflection of that.
Right. And one of the things that had me hollering was the stance. So, no, not, I'm sorry, not the stance, the squat. So when I saw the squat, I knew exactly what you were talking about. So for those who may not know or may not remember, when Little Kim debuted, what year was that she debuted? It was, do you remember?
96.
Six, yeah.
The album was, yeah.
It was the Ill Not, was it, what was the name of her album?
The hardcore album was, yeah. Hardcore was
Foxy Brown. But to promote her album in Times Square, there was a picture of Lil' Kim bikini clad and in a squat from the vantage point that you could see her crotch. And I worked in the area at the time, and you know, I remember my, you know, my jaw dropping when I saw that because of how sexualized it was, how large it was, and how young she appeared. So, so you write about that. How did you? And that's what's really cool about your book. It's not only that you're covering these women, but you're contextualizing the culture and the time periods they came out in and what was going on. And that was pretty. That was pretty eyebrow raising back then, right?
Right, right. It's placing them in a moment, and my thing has been that you know, you can, you know, creating this alternate timeline of hip hop, you can tell a story of the culture like solely through the women. You can see all the touch points, and kind of like from the beginning of hip hop in the 70s, where there were young girls getting into it, they were breakdancing, they were DJing. You know, you can start there until now and tell this really rich story of the culture just from their perspective. And so, you know, I wanted to, with Kim specifically, you know, she came out during a really kind of like nouveau time of hip hop, when it was becoming the dominant, rap was becoming the dominant genre and overtaking country music. And, you know, within that, it's really important to highlight that Kim, this like young Black woman, was a huge part of making hip hop what it is today. Like
Right.
without her, it wouldn't, you know, this mid 90s movement with Bad Boy, and you know, the kind of like flossy luxury rap, for better or worse, like it wouldn't be what it is today without her. And so there's no way to kind of tell her story without telling us a bigger story about not just hip hop, but like hip hop within, like in America, and like what it was doing to youth, or like how it was kind of like shifting culture in this huge way. And so when you look at it in the granular sense, and then in that kind of like, you know, macro, like it's so like wonderful to like just think about like this, you know, it seems like they're kind of like tiny specks in the I guess like entire story, but you know, they all together, all these stories, Kim and Trina and Missy and Lauren, they, you know, it's like the mosaic that makes up this like world of hip hop, and of hip hop in America, I should say. So yeah, it was, Kim's was that like, you know, jaw drop, like needle drop moment in the culture that does not happen like a lot, you know.
Right, right. It's also pretty incredible to me that there are 100 plus women who made hip hop. We don't think of the sheer number, you know, especially a lot of the pioneering female MCs. I forgot to say, Maureen, you have photographs in your book. So your book has visuals also. Was it, what was the process like finding some of those photographs that you used? There's a beautiful one of Big Mama Thornton.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be able to just, you know, to find these photographs. The photographers were very generous. And so the cover photo, I'm sitting with my book cover behind me. The cover photo is a Baron Wallman photo. And Baron Wallman was the founding photo editor of Rolling Stone magazine. And so he was out, you know, taking pictures of everyone who was coming through San Francisco. And there's some great, he took some beautiful photos of Big Mama Thornton. And then this photo of Tina Turner. Tina Turner appeared on the second issue of Rolling Stone. And this is the photo. So we asked him permission, and he was very generous. Baron passed away in November, but he was really generous with his photographs. And he's a really sensitive photographer. He doesn't objectify the women. They're not strange, these strange Black figures to him. He was a European American photographer, but I think he really had a great eye and a great sensitivity. So I reached out to photographers whose pictures I liked and asked them if I could use them in the book. And then I also worked with a photo agency, a service that collects photographs. And I had a really great, someone who became my friend over the process, who was a collector. And he had deposited a lot of his photographs with this one particular agency, and they worked out a deal with me so that it wasn't too expensive. And so I was able to include a lot of photographs of the women. And I mean, similar to what Clover said, I thought it was really important because these women, in some cases, are not well known, but their sound is well known. We've been listening to their music, or we've been listening to their influence without knowing where it came from. And so I really wanted, in the way you say you want to put, you know, a face and a name to a sound. And so that's what I was trying to do with the inclusion of the photographs in the book.
And you say this photograph of Tina Turner was on the second issue of Rolling Stone?
Right. And I think that's significant. I think it's significant that this magazine that, you know, was started to be like a serious, this is really where you start to have serious writing about popular music. There's Crawdaddy that started a little bit before Rolling Stone, and then Rolling Stone. And this is where you start to get people writing not just little capsule reviews of records, but talking more about the connections between music and culture, music and politics. And of course, in the late 60s, Rolling Stone was founded in November of 1967. So in this period, there's a lot to talk about. The cover photo is the first cover was John Lennon of the Beatles in something that looked like an army helmet. So there's a kind of commentary on the Vietnam War and a critique, you know, that's just sort of built into that. So I think it's significant that on the second issue of that magazine, the sort of upstart underground newspaper, they put Tina Turner on the cover, and they talk about her as having this incredible stage presence, this incredible voice. They talk about her sexuality. There's a lot of, you know, objectification and fascination with African-American women's sexuality. We all know that, and that comes through in the discussion. But I think when we, looking back on the history and there's this assumption about the whitening of rock and roll, I think it's significant to see that in the moment, there was a recognition of the significance of African-American presence and African-American contributions, but then over time, that gets sort of pushed under the rug. And so we have to do, the kind of excavation that Clover is doing for women in hip hop, because women's contributions just, they get swept aside. They are, and every time a new woman appears on the scene, it's sort of like she has to explain herself. Her arrival seems strange, where in fact, there's a long history of women being present in these spaces, but they just keep getting overlooked or pushed to the side, and men are, placed in front of them. So that's why, we're having to do this kind of recovery work. To put women's voices back into the center, because those voices have been so important to the formation of music in American culture.
On that note, in your introduction, you talk about Santa Gold's, Santi White, the singer known as Santa Gold, her labeling dilemma. And would you talk about how the music industry has historically limited Black artists, particularly Black women artists, who do not easily fit into the categories they reserve for them?
Sure. With Santi White, she had no dilemma about her music genre category. She said, she started out as a punk rock person. So she had a punk band called Stiffed. But she also didn't want to be limited by genre. And some of her early writing was with an artist named Rez, and that's more of a kind of 90s, it's not neo soul, but it's in a sort of R&B and soul feel. So she was moving across a lot of genres, and that's confusing to the recording industry. Especially for Black artists, there's a desire to just kind of stay in one place, to have them stay in one place, and then to stay in a particular place. So with when Santi White started to, the work she was producing in the early 2000s, that music was kind of multi-genre, it was multifaceted. It wasn't simply R&B, but that's what it got labeled because she was Black. And it really made her angry. And I start with that story because I think it's emblematic of the way the genre labeling happens in the recording industry. There's a really close association between one's racial and gender identity and one's music genre. And so there's certain assumptions that are made. And if you're going outside of those assumptions, you're hard to understand and you're hard to market. And often you just get left to the side. And so for rock, the idea was this is music for white audiences, performed by white people. And so if you have a Black artist, it's confusing. And then it's especially confusing because I think really with most music, the assumption is the musicians are going to be men. So if you have women who are out front, that's confusing. So for Black women, they had a sort of double issue in trying to be heard in rock. And for a group like LaBelle, for example, they thought about themselves as being the female version of the Rolling Stones. That was a hard idea for people to get their minds around, because the thought was, well, wait, how can Black women be doing rock? That, we're not expecting that. But they were out on the road, not on the road, but they were out touring with The Who, which is a white English rock band. They were opening for them. So they were getting exposed to rock audiences. But the common sense was, this isn't something that Black women should be doing, and it's not something that anyone really wants to hear Black women doing. And so it was, it's through a lot of perseverance that these women developed their careers and got their music out there.
Let's talk a little bit about appropriation in both genres. Clover, you begin talking about Big Mama Thornton, who, by all accounts, seems to have been like the godmother of rock and roll. Would you agree with that? Or
Oh, for me?
yes.
Maureen.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, Maureen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you know, they're different. It's always hard. I love the beginning of Clover's book where she's trying to sort of suss out, okay, who's the
Mm.
first female rap artist? You know, because it's always hard to find a first, and everyone wants to say they're first. So
Right.
some people are. There's been a lot of claiming of Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the
Okay.
gospel singer and guitarist, as formative, you know, to rock and roll, to the development of rock and roll, especially with her guitar style being picked up by people like Chuck Berry. Um, so I think that Big Mama Thornton is absolutely formative, but I don't know how to decide who would be the first. But I would say I start with her because of in the timeline that I'm working with, she precedes the label, the term rock and roll, but the sound, what she was doing, you know, her instrumentation, she just had a bass and a drum and a guitar. She didn't have a bunch of horns. Horns were really much, you know, what people had on R&B records back in the early 50s. She didn't have that. Just bass, drums, guitar. That's the band. That's a rock band.
Hmm.
And her attitude is the other thing that I think is so important to rock and roll, to the feel of rock and roll. So I think she was central. And I think the other thing with her is that her sound was she was an inspiration for and she was appropriated by white rock artists who blew up covering her song. So Elvis Presley's biggest hit was Hound Dog, which is the song she originated. And Janis Joplin's biggest hit was Ball and Chain, which is a song that Big Mama Thornton originated. And so I think that that influence that she had, you know, early on, she sets the tone for rock and roll. But I think also that experience of being, you can say, borrowed from or appropriated by others without adequate acknowledgement. As far as Elvis Presley was concerned, Janis Joplin did acknowledge her, but the money didn't come to Big Mama Thornton. So the other piece of this is the contributions that these artists make and the fact that they're not able, for the most part, to reap the economic rewards that have been so important to creating. When you think about the American recording industry, it's built on African-American artistry. But African-American artists have really, you know, there's some people who have made their money, but, you know, overall, for what they have contributed, they have not reaped the economic benefits of that contribution.
And Clover, despite the presence of Black female MCs at the beginning of hip hop, Debbie Harry of Blondie, a white woman, was the first woman to rhyme on a song that hit the Hot 100. Why did you choose to include her in Motherlode?
Yeah, I kind of, you know, initially was sort of like, how do I fit her into the story? You know, and I wanted to have some sort of critical element because she is an important kind of like pioneer in the story of hip hop. At the same time, you know, there was a phenomenon that like kind of sort of like started with you know, Rapture um, up until like an Iggy Azalea, you know, where all, you know, all these artists and all these kind of like MCs were doing and creating and pushing, uplifting the culture. And then, you know, this, you know, like white, primarily rock singer comes and makes a song that then, you know, becomes like, you know, the first song with a rap on it to kind of like hit the charts, to like to go number one. And so that in itself kind of tells just such a rich story of how hip hop gets reclaimed, and also how it was not just happening with the men in the culture. It's like it's happening with the women in the culture because there were women who. Why didn't a Roxanne Shante be the first one to have like a number one, you know, single with Roxanne's Revenge, you know? So that you know, I wanted to include that piece of history, but there is like, again, like a larger story about hip hop in America that can be told through Debbie Harry and through like that song becoming you know, this quintessential, like when people talk about early hip hop, they mention Rapture and may forget all of, or don't even know like an MC Shyrock who, you know, was part of like a break dancer who was, you know, it's considered to be kind of like, in by all accounts, like the first prominent like female MC. And so, or people like a Debbie D or Pebbly Pooh, you know, there were so many kind of like beneath Debbie Harry's kind of like shadow, sort of, the women who allowed her to kind of like even have that stage. And so it just tells such a it tells such a kind of like story about like how the culture gets borrowed and just how it you know, shifts from this thing that was, you know, an underground, something that is a huge sensation only because, I won't say only because, but like through the like tunnel or through the vehicle of a white woman. And so
And she
yeah,
was,
like it was important.
she
Yeah.
wasn't trying to be a rapper. She was just kind of giving a
Right.
nod to this new music form. But you also
Right.
mentioned the first artists and songs that like crossed over were not by Black
Right.
artists.
Right.
It was
Marky
who?
Mark.
Marky Mark.
Vanilla Ice.
Was that the first
Right. Yeah.
rap song to get, I don't know, to go to the
Vanilla Ice, right, Ice Baby, right. And then like Marky Mark. So my whole kind of, yeah, that her entry is like, it's not even, there were like 3 white artists or so before like, you know, like a Black rapper got like a #1 single. And so, you know, when you see that in terms of the timeline of hip hop, it's kind of and just how the underground versus mainstream, commercial versus like you know, indie, like it's, you know, that is important to kind of see where women's place in that story is as well.
Maureen, you highlight lesser known women who were in the rock and roll scene, like in the late 60s. Um, Women like Devin Wilson, Marsha Hunt, Claudia Lanier. Tell us who they were and how their proximity to white male rockers, particularly Mick Jagger, impacted their careers and how they impacted those men's careers.
Yeah, I wanted to include a chapter on women who might broadly be labeled groupies, although they were more than that. And that term groupie is really interesting because it's a way of putting women in a box again. And in the late 60s, the expectation was that if you were a woman, you were not going to be on stage performing. So the sort of way you would be connected to rock would be as a groupie. And so I was interested in 3 African-American women, and there are more, but I focus on these 3 who were really active in the rock scene of the late 60s and the early 70s, who were, for the most part, doing other kinds of things, but because of their connections with rock musicians, which was something they took a lot of pleasure in, they enjoyed being in the scene, they enjoyed connecting with these men. They get kind of put in that box. So I wanted to tell a little bit more about them. And I use the song Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones as a way into the discussion because that's one of the Rolling Stones' most well-known songs. It's a song that they always perform when they perform live. And it's a song about a Black woman, and it's a very problematic song about a Black woman. It's, you know, a sexualized image of a Black woman, and it's set in slavery times. So it's sort of an odd song to be a big rock and roll song, but that's what it is. And so I use that song and 3 women who have been talked about as possible inspirations for that song to talk about Black women's participation in rock and roll, you know, not only on stage, but behind the scenes. Claudia Lanier is usually the one who is thought of as, you know, really being the woman that Mick Jagger had in mind when he wrote that song. And she was a background vocalist and she was on the rock scene. She actually started out as an Ikette. So she performed with the Ike and Tina Turner Review.
And isn't she featured in 20 Feet from Stardom?
Absolutely, yes. And she is in 20 Feet from Stardom. And so she had a career in the world of rock, and then she left, and now she's a professor in Southern California. She teaches Spanish. But in her, in the 70s, she was touring with Joe Cocker. She was in recording studios doing background vocals, and she was also dating Mick Jagger. So she's one of the women I talk about. I talk about Devin Wilson, who's most closely associated with Jimi Hendrix, and she was known as a super groupie, and being in the scene was really her thing. She wasn't trying to be a singer or an artist. And she also had a very publicly recognized liaison with Mick Jagger. And then the third woman I write about is Marsha Hunt, who's really fascinating. And she's written a memoir called Real Life. And she was born in Philadelphia, grew up, had her teen years in Berkeley, and then decided that she wanted to go to London. And she just ended up there right at the moment of swinging London and got into music, even though she wasn't really a fantastic singer, because she was a Black woman and she was a very beautiful woman, or I should say she is. She just kind of made a splash in London at a time when there was a lot of interest in African-American culture. She was in the London run of Hair. That's where she really got a lot of attention, including the attention of Mick Jagger. So they started a brief affair that resulted in the birth of his first child. And so Marsha Hunt did all kinds of different, she was a singer, she was an actor, she hosted a radio talk show where she was interviewing people. She also recorded an album in the early 70s. And so she was trying to do something kind of experimental, something that wasn't a soul or R&B record. And it was never released in the United States, but she was doing a lot of different things. So I thought it was just interesting to talk about these women who were really owning their sexuality, they were owning, their desire to experiment creatively and socially. They were crossing racial lines in terms of their relationships. So they were doing a lot of daring things. And I just wanted to put those stories into the record.
I think it's also interesting, the concept of groupies is, women following behind, stars like these fans. But these were some fly women, and they made those guys look appealing and attractive because of what they brought to the table.
Yeah.
And their sense of style and just their whole being made the men more appealing.
Exactly. Like those guys really would not have been very interesting if women weren't standing next to them and also helping them dress. There's a lot of style. And I also talk about Betty Davis, Betty Mabry Davis, who had a very short, like just about a year-long marriage to the jazz trumpeter Miles Davis in the late 60s. But that moment was really formative for him because she connected him with the youth culture. She was about 20 years younger than he was. And he was, he was this old jazz guy at the point when they met. And she got him into different clothes, got him into different music. She introduced him to Jimi Hendrix. She turned him on to Sly Stone. And it really pushed him to the music that he was creating in the early 70s, especially Bitches Brew, which is a title that she came up with. She owned that title. So these women are very significant in their contributions, but if you just call them a groupie, it's kind of like a label, and you label and dismiss.
Right.
I wanted to spend a little time with them because, I think they were really cool and they were doing really, really cool things.
Let's talk about style, because in both genres, because there's such a premium on the way women appear. Style is a big part of Black women in rock and also women in MCs. Clover, do you want to talk, I'll start with you, about like the evolution of female hip hop style, what it looked like when it started and what it evolved into?
Right. And so in the beginning, I would say let's start maybe at the 80s, when it's on a more commercial stage with Salt and Pepper and MC Light and, Queen Latifah, it's a more like tomboyish style with Salt and Pepper. They obviously like had songs that were sexy and they talked about sex. And they kind of like dress up, there were times when they kind of like mixed the tomboy and like more, what would be like traditionally feminine clothing. But like the MC Lights and people who kind of sort of maybe unintentionally or intentionally wanted to kind of like blend in with the boys, blend in with the guys, it's like you end up, wearing the baggy jeans and the fitteds and the, kind of jerseys and things like that. So then we kind of see this transition with Kim and Foxy, like the mid 90s era, where it's, they are wearing designer clothing, they're bringing like high luxury and, runway brands to kind of like a main stage, as part of this bigger trend of hip hop kind of getting into talking about luxury and rapping about luxury and actually attaining money and then rapping about having money. So, women in terms of image, I think there's an important starting point with Kim and Foxy of image itself sort of being like created, like image then becoming like an important part of the artistry. And then the industry labels, A&Rs, executives then wanting to, copy the success of Kim and Foxy by now having the situation where other women had to kind of like be sexy in their footsteps. Because it's like, okay, well, they sold and they were, stylish and kind of like in this very provocative way. So now if you don't match that, then we don't know what to do with you, sort of thing. So it ended up being this sort of, industry, what happens in the industry where they're looking for the next big thing that looks like the last thing. And so, all the, like a few of the women I spoke to were like, they did feel that pressure to kind of like, to do what Kim and Foxy did. Or like, if you can't be sexy in a video or kind of wear a swimsuit, then, you feel like, where's your place in that space? So, in terms of style, it was this kind of combination of fashion and like, actually being trendsetters, and then style also being associated with like their actual persona and image and, what they were selling, like this selling of sex happening through style.
Right. Because in the case of Megan Thee Stallion, Nicki Minaj, and certainly Cardi B, it's like a hyper sexualization. So if we thought, Little Kim squatting was provocative, it's gone in a whole other direction where everything looks so glossed and, there's this level of perfection. Sometimes when I see them in magazines, it's almost like they don't even have pores in their face. Everything's just,
yeah.
It's on a whole different level. Maureen, you talk about Laverne Baker, who, like a lot of women in her era, performed, with evening gowns on and dresses and things like that. Talk about how, it went from that in the Shirelles girl groups, looking, perfectly coiffed with these dresses to Betty Davis or some of the contemporary rock women we see now.
Yeah, well, in the 50s and the early 60s, if you look at what everybody, African American, European American, all of those performers were always dressed up in evening wear. So the men are in really, beautiful suits, sometimes even like, tuxedos, and the women are wearing gowns. And, this was really this was an important way of showing respectability, and also a tradition in African American culture of just, dressing up. That you don't just go out in a pair of sweatpants and, a t-shirt. That if you're going out, the audience was dressed up and the people on stage were dressed up. So that's the early 50s and into the 1950s and into the early 60s. And then in the late 60s, you get the counterculture. And so that starts to get challenged, and you start to have more experimental looks, more streetwear on stage. But actually, if you look at the outfits that, rock bands were wearing in the late 60s, they're still, in a lot of cases, in matching uniforms. Like the Beatles were basically wearing, still wearing suits. The Rolling Stones were a little bit more shabby, so they might be wearing a vest instead of a suit jacket. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, they're wearing suits, and then it just starts to open up, and people are starting to wear on stage what people are wearing out on the street. With Betty Davis in the early 70s, she goes with, first with streetwear, hot pants. I also have a picture of Marsha Hunt in a pair of hot pants. She claims that she was the first, person to wear those on stage. I don't know if that's true. But something, very revealing. And so they're starting to reveal their bodies in a way that's dangerous for African-American women because of the assumptions about African-American women and sexuality. So they're really pushing against some stereotypes and just, owning their sexuality in part through this sort of revealing clothing. And then you have LaBelle, who first start out in streetwear, by which I mean, wearing jeans and maybe a turtleneck sweater and boots, something that you'd wear to walk around the East Village or, walk around in London. And then they switch to these costumes that some people refer to as the silver spacesuits, where they have, they look like Afrofuturism. I have a photo in the book because it was a striking image. It was so different from what other artists were wearing. They were sort of taking British glam rock, but going in a different direction. So it's kind of like Vegas showgirl with the headdresses, sequins, shiny silver fabric, big platform boots, and really, crazy kind of makeup. So they looked different, they stood out. And so there's this level of theatricality with their style, the way they entered the stage. There's one famous show where Patti LaBelle was lowered from the ceiling at the Metropolitan Opera, sort of, like, I guess, flying down with her arms flapping in one of these fantastic costumes. So they were really doing not just this amazing singing, but also, setting the stage, doing this work on stage to attract attention, to really put on a different kind of a show.
I remember radio promos for LaBelle when I was a kid in Baltimore, and they would encourage people to wear metallic colors, wear your silver, your bronze, your gold when you go to see their concert. I kind of remember them with their street clothes, but then I definitely remember their Afrofuturistic look. So,
Yeah.
And another person in terms of style who made a transition, as I like to say, rock music found Tina Turner. She was always there. They found her,
Right.
They had to catch up with her. Could you talk a little bit about her style evolution?
Yeah, it's a similar trajectory. And if you look at, I've been doing some research on Tina Turner in the 50s and the early 60s, and she was wearing gowns. She was dressed very much like the way Laverne Baker or the Shirelles or other girl groups were dressed. And then slowly the hemlines start to go up and you start to see more leg. The Ikettes, who are the trio of women who back her vocally and in the dancing, are also starting to wear shorter skirts. And so as mini skirts come into fashion in the 1960s, the Ikettes and Tina start to wear those styles. And they're also doing what's basically a kind of go-go dancing. So it's a different type of dancing than people would have been doing to rhythm and blues or rock and roll in the 1950s. It's a much more aggressive type of dancing. And so that's what they were associated with through the 60s. In the late 60s, they start covering rock songs. So they're covering songs by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Led Zeppelin. And then the most famous one is Proud Mary, which is a cover of a Creedence Clearwater Revival song. So she was just like saying, you white rockers are doing Black music. Let me show you how we Black people do this Black music. And then, and the costumes, she, looking back on them, was talking about how much she disliked some of those costumes because it's kind of like Tarzan and Tarzan's, girlfriend,
Tarzan
or whoever she was.
Right.
Yeah, Jane. And these sort of shredded clothes, and there's always holes, strategically placed. And Tina Turner as a person, always beautifully, really likes the kind of designer fashions that Clover was talking about, high European fashion. That's what she likes to wear, when she's not on the stage. So wear those are stage costumes. Then when she goes solo, she really creates a look that said, I'm a rocker. So she's wearing black leather, she's wearing jeans, she's got a haircut that kind of looked like the haircut that the British rocker Rod Stewart had, kind of choppy, blonde. She was always, you know, we love Tina for her wigs. And she would still wear the short skirts, but they were, I would say, more tasteful than what she was wearing maybe in the 60s. And also, you know, she's a decade older. And so she's, you know, handling her body in a different way on stage. But she always, you know, she always looks phenomenal. And the other thing with her, she was an athlete in high school. She was a cheerleader and she was on the basketball team. And that athleticism comes through in her dancing, that it's a real, so much energy. And then I still don't understand how she can sing, you know, how she has the lung power to sing the way she does when she's doing all of that, the physicality of the dance and what that demands, and then what the vocals demands. But she, you know, she's a pro, so she's able to put all of that together. So yeah, she's had quite a trajectory with her style.
A question for both of you. Today's MCs and Black rock women, I'll say, they seem to have more agency over their careers and their image and just how they express themselves. Is that an accurate assumption? Clover, you want to answer?
Right. Yeah, I'm always leery of kind of like, I think yes. At the same time, there are so many ways in which the industry still controls access and image and kind of like who is allowed to be out front. But there's definitely been a wave of women who have like reclaimed their kind of like power, their image. I always say even the presence of like social media being this vehicle, this tool where they can actually control how they disperse, how they show themselves, what they put out. They can very easily like take a picture and just post it. And that is very different from the 90s. You know, where there were so many kind of steps to get even just getting a picture of yourself out. And so there is a level of control and sort of agency that comes with that. They can be themselves more. You know, someone like Sweetie can like create these video clips and nuggets where she's showing that she's funny and like she's, you know, kind of showing off her humor and in addition to like her rap skills. And you know, Cardi B obviously kind of like jump started that whole wave with, you know, in her Vine videos and putting out these, you know, just funny, essentially like stand-up bites of herself, you know, online. And so there is a level of image kind of like access and image kind of control that happens. And so they, you know, some Megan's, the Cardis, the Doja Cats, you know, they can go on Instagram Live and just talk directly to fans. So I would say, you know, social media has been a great thing for women MCs in particular, because it opens up the door for there to be multiple voices and multiple kind of like spaces where women can create their own fan base and create their own and get their sound out without the, you know, the gatekeepers. But that's not to say the gatekeepers still don't at some point have some assertion of control. So, you know, but it would be, you know, there's definitely been like a shift in the past, I would say, you know, in the past like 5 years or more.
How about you, Maureen? I think the thing that I sort of tend to dwell on is the question of how can someone make a living making music now in a period where people seem to be reluctant to pay for music, where there's an expectation that music will be free, or you're using a streaming service, you pay the streaming service, and the kinds of arrangements that the streaming services make with artists are really, when you look at like it's a portion of a penny that artists are getting paid for plays. So that's something that I think about. You could actually make a living as a musician in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe not you know, super rich, but you could, now I think it's really a question. And I think, so one of the things I've noted is the way people sort of pivot to do other things. I'm thinking about Tamar Kali, who is a great rock singer. She was featured in the documentary Afropunk. And in recent years, she's been working on soundtracks. So she did the soundtrack to the Dee Rees film Mudbound, and she's she's been working on a few other soundtracks. So she's sort of moved in that direction because it was an action. You can actually make money doing soundtracks in a way that gigging and trying to work through, you know, selling your music online doesn't reap as much. And then just the other person who comes to mind as an example of sort of where Black women in rock are now, I think of Brittany Howard, who
Brittany Howard, formerly of
Alabama Shakes, right? And so she has gone solo. She's, I think I think of her, the first solo album, which came out, I guess it was released in, I think, 2018. Time is sort of mushy to me now.
Right, everybody.
But it was also a kind of coming out album for her, where she had never talked about her sexuality so openly in the music, but then she started doing that on this record. Like, she just decided, you know, I'm not going to be quiet about this, and, you know, I'm going to talk about wherever things take me. That's what I'm going to talk about. And so we, you know, hear her doing that. And so I think there's just, you know, there's more openness now. And she, you know, waded right into that. So, and then the other one that comes to mind is a group much younger, probably in their 20s, Meet Me at the Altar, who just don't feel like they have to explain, you know, why are they doing this music? Why are you in a band instead of doing R&B or doing hip hop? They just do it, they just own it. And so I think there is, you know, there have been positive changes. These women that I'm talking about in my book have, you know, have paved a way for the next generations of women to, you know, move into this music and kind of do their own thing with it.
And I would add to that, just in terms of control, like, I think of someone like a Megan Thee Stallion, like, her fan base is called Hotties. And like a lot of these newer women rappers, they are like, they're speaking primarily to their young women fans, and they are very directly addressing them, and like the sexuality and the gaze is kind of like, are like, let's twerk for us sort of thing. And obviously there's also the male gaze is always there, and there's that audience of like attracting the male listener is always there. But I just think it's interesting that that's a level of control also, like her naming them the Hotties, and, you know, being able to kind of speak directly to like, all right, this is for the girls, you know, like that is a, you know, like, I think a radical thing.
What artists are on current rotation for you guys? Who are you listening to? Clover?
I've been listening to Flo Milli, who's like just really kind of this kind of audacious young star. Definitely just kind of, I have a mix of, because I have this playlist that I made along with the book and discovered newer artists even from when I finished the book. And so I, you know, have like Chica, who's like another like really promising young rapper. Yeah, it's that Tierra Whack, Cam and China, or like, this is like they're kind of a sister duo who put out videos on Instagram where they're kind of like doing rap covers, freestyles over, you know, like known beats, well-known beats. And
oh, wow.
there are people that I'd kind of like check on Instagram, basically, like I listen to on Instagram. So yeah.
How about you, Maureen?
I went through I guess the edits of my book in the early part of the pandemic. I was listening to a lot of Alice Coltrane, actually. I listened to people like Tamar Kali. I've been liking the Georgia Ann Muldrow, and There's a British group called Big Joni, kind of a black punk group.
All women?
All women,
All women.
yeah, yeah. And then this newer group that I just mentioned, Meet Me at the Altar. So I go back and forth between that, and then for research purposes, I've also been listening to Tina Turner, Ike and Tina Turner from the 1960s for this piece that I've been working on this summer. So it's always a bit of a mixed bag over here.
Do you all, what are the hip hop and rock critics, the kind of gatekeeper critics saying about your books? Do you know? What are the guys saying about your books? In other words, have you heard any? I've seen rave reviews from lots of people on both of your books, but I was wondering if anyone had.
That's such an interesting question, because as I'm like sifting through who I know who has said something about my book, I think I'm like, it's a bunch of women. So the little note that I had sent you, Julia, was that the book was named one of the best music books of 2020 by Pitchfork.
Yes.
And by No Depression. So that was good news. And I got a very nice boost. I guess just last week, the Museum of African American History in Boston has a prize called the Stone Book Award. And my book is one of the 10 books shortlisted for that award. Excellent. So that's been, a nice boost. I have to say, and it's not that, you care about what people think when you write these books, but I wasn't really thinking about my audience for this book as being a male reader. I really was writing this book. I was thinking about women who would want to know about women like this. That sort of was so when I was imagining a reader, and I have some, close friends who I imagine like, what would she think about this? Or I should, this is the kind of question she would, want addressed. And that's really who I was thinking about. And then I had this sort of feeling like, oh yeah, what are the guys going to say? Because, but certainly would be very happy for them to read the book, but that wasn't the audience that I was really concerning myself with.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's interesting is, and I guess like thrilling in a way, is when the older kind of like generation of men who've kind of like have this wealth of knowledge, a couple like Ralph McDaniels for Video Music Box, or Sway Calloway, kind of like have read the book and been able to kind of pick out some information or people that they didn't know. And I think that is, a lot of times like the whole, male critics, like within the music world, there's just this whole kind of idea that they just know, not know everything, but kind of their whole thing is like having like facts and like knowing, kind of having like these kind of this kind of like encyclopedic brain. And so I think it's interesting when within that they don't hold women in that space in a way, in the same way that they do male artists. Right. Their history or their personal history is like filled with all these guys that they grew up on, and they may have like the kind of like a few women sprinkled in, but like they're kind of, whereas our personal history is like we have women like in our personal music history, like they're everywhere. And so that it has been an interesting kind of thing to witness amongst the sort of older generation, where it's like, oh, I didn't know about that artist, or I didn't know this. So like that's been, I guess, like a cool thing.
Well, I'm gonna have to wrap it up, ladies. I have way more questions and could talk to you all night long, but thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been very informative. I encourage everybody to get these 2 books and read them, pass them on. Just great history, things that we've always been doing as women. So thank you so much. And everyone else, join us tomorrow, Thursday, July 29th at 7:00 p.m. on Instagram Live. We're celebrating the 39th anniversary of the novel, The Color Purple. And to help us celebrate, we'll be in conversation with Salamisha Tillett, author of In Search of the Color Purple. Thanks again, Maureen and Clover, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Julie. Good night.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Julie, are you still there?
Okay, I think we lost that.
Well, it was great paneling with you, Clover.
You too. That was amazing. Thank you so much for like, collaborating with me. I'm like honored myself. So
yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah.
I guess we can just sign off.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good night.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good night.
night.
Thank you all. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.